one of the things that's really interesting about the biology is that it can tell you a lot about what you're going through, and in some ways, sometimes that's a much more objective evaluation of what you're going through than what you report and what you actually feel. So when you are nervous, when you are scared, when you're upset, your heart rate increases. You get a physiological response. You have glands that secrete a hormone that you guys know as epinephrine, right? Adrenaline. You get the adrenaline rush. Well, that adrenaline has an impact on the brain. It can change how you process things. And it's intended to do that, evolutionarily speaking, because every time you're in a situation where you have something really, really emotional happen, something that's very powerful, captivating, either scares the bejesus out of you or is really, really rewarding and happy, and you really want to be able to recall that later, well, the adrenaline has an impact on the brain that tells it what just happened is really important. That's like one of the most important things that's ever going to happen to you, so you better keep track of that, right? It's a very important memory. And if we look deep into the brain, hard to do this in humans, we do it in animal studies all the time, after having an emotional experience, those memories are stored in the brain with much higher fidelity. So these memories are stored just in connections between different brain cells, and now those connections are much stronger. Those cells are talking to each other a lot more. So there's a physical footprint to things that happen to you that are very important. But the reason I mention that is because as you think about a character developing over time, things that are highly emotional, things that have high arousal value, things that either threaten the person's existence, or things that are so rewarding that they really should remember it later on so they can do more of that, are going to be those defining moments that are best remembered. Which means they're going to have a higher weight in terms of their predictive model. So as they're anticipating the environment and thinking about what's going to happen next, the things that happened in their past that were most salient, those defining moments, are going to be the things that they're going to use much more to predict what's going to happen next. In some instances, this can be really damaging, really negative, right? Like trauma. That's what PTSD is entirely based on. Having traumatic experiences that come back and sort of haunt the person's consciousness because they're so powerful, because they've been stored in the brain with very high fidelity, and they color how the person is going to anticipate what's going to happen next. Okay? That's why they can have a lot of anxiety in environments that may not be threatening otherwise. So there are certain facets of how that narrative comes about and is built that have to do with how we structure our lives around salient experiences and emotional experiences. Again, understanding and knowing that means as you start to build up characters and narratives, you can think about how to make them very rich with these emotional experiences. Construct them around certain defining moments and experiences, and think about what is the impact of that on this person by thinking, what would be the impact if it happened to me? What would be my experience? So you use your simulator and all of your experiences as the gateway to craft that new character's experience. And by doing that, you're actually doing something very, very natural. It doesn't feel like fake anymore. It doesn't feel like acting, or it doesn't even feel all that creative anymore. It just feels natural. It just feels like this is a natural consequence of thinking about my life and how it unfolded. So I think it makes the creative exercise come much more easily that way.
It's for me later.
Okay, fine. All right, so how am I doing so far? Give me some cues here. What else do you want to hear about? Because
So that's great. Okay, first of all, does anybody have any questions about the impact of past experience or memory on behavior? They could be about the mechanisms, how it works. Does anybody have any questions at this point about memory? Okay, awesome. So the one thing I just want you to establish at this point is that our behavior is almost entirely, I would say entirely, the result of your past experiences. And therefore, your characters, behaviors, responses in the imaginary circumstances are also entirely predictive based on their past experience. Okay, so now, let's use your wisdom to talk a little bit about what I'm going to term, and I want to say something. Here's something really interesting. You actually might enjoy this, Professor. Is the one thing that I find about transdisciplinary interactions is once you understand the vocabulary, it actually opens up a world. Because, right, I would never know to look up research on simulation, right? That's not a word that we use as writers and actors. But now you know this word simulating means something very particular to neuroscientists. You can look it up, and there's thousands of studies on simulation and ways that you can learn how to do it. So, okay, so that's one thing I just want to point out, and that's why I wrote that down. So the second thing I'd like you to talk about a little bit about is about language as a function of the brain. How do we choose the words we choose in the end, uniquely as individuals?
No, absolutely. Great question. So, and language is one of those things, just like memory, that is a whole brain phenomenon. So everything you have, all of this intricate machinery, can be used to support linguistic function. And language, typically when you think about it in the brain, you think about it in terms of two components. There's production and there's understanding, right? How do I produce language? How do I understand language? And if you're lucky, you're doing both all the time. Sometimes you do have a conversation with somebody and all you're thinking about is what you're going to say next, so production, and there's a lack of understanding. But normally we're pretty good at being able to kind of have a dialogue. A dialogue means it's a real back and forth. So not only are you understanding what they're saying, but right now I am hearing and understanding what I'm saying. And that tends to be critical because there are cases of patients with brain damage where that's missing. Now they can communicate, they can talk, but it just sounds like garbled junk. It's real words, but they're not strung together with any real coherence. They're not understood, and the person doesn't understand what they're actually producing. Okay, this is called fluent aphasia. They don't have a problem with fluency. They're fluent, but they have a linguistic deficit in that they cannot understand. Now, there are other patients that have brain damage to other parts of the brain that can understand you perfectly fine, but can't respond to you at all. You ask questions and they are just struggling to find the words. They just keep and they might come up with one or two words, but it's not a sentence. It's not a coherent dialogue, right? So they understand they have a problem with production. And then there are a third type of brain patients, or brain lesion patients, those who have brain damage, that have a disconnection, right? So the two parts of the brain that are really responsible for understanding and production are intact, but their communication is disrupted. So they can understand just fine, they can produce just fine, but those two are out of sync with each other. And that's one of the most interesting deficits in all of neuroscience. Because if you ask them a question, they'll pick up on it and they'll start answering, and within a few seconds, they will lose it. They will lose track and start saying things that don't make any sense, and then you just have to get them back on track, so they listen for a few seconds and then they veer off again. And they're very, very interesting patients, and that shows you that this is an intricate process. It requires intact understanding, intact production, but more importantly, those two have to sync. And that's what you're doing with dialogue. So every time you choose a word, that word is chosen based on your understanding of what already has been said. And you know this because you choose your words based on what the person is telling you. And based on what the person is telling you, you're going to adjust your narrative, adjust the choice of words that you use because of the flexibility of understanding to production, understanding to production. So I'm going to use just a little reminder here. There's speech understanding and speech production. And of course, these two have to be this sort of infinite cycle. Now, what can influence speech understanding? Lots of things can influence this. One is obviously past history. So let's say that I have a certain notion about the person who's speaking to me right now, certain past experience with them. My interpretation of their meaning for what they say might be colored by that. So again, it's a way that memory can influence how you understand language. So that's past history. The other thing is context. If I say duck, and the context is, there's roast duck here in the corner, versus duck and, people are shooting, it's a very different context. So context influences how you understand speech. And context is a lot of things. It's the circumstance, it's time of day, it's how much you've eaten that day, how much coffee you've had, how many people you're surrounded by, how crowded it is, how noisy it is, how well lit it is. All of those things influence your speech understanding. Okay? And those are the two big ones, right? Context, which kind of gives you a piece of the present, and history, which is a little piece of the past. Okay? Now on this side, on speech production, Again, you have a few influences. One of them is also context. There are certain things that are going to be appropriate for me to say in certain contexts, totally inappropriate to say in other contexts. Okay? So context influences my choice of words. But the other thing that you also have to add here is future. You think about the consequences of the words that you use. You're simulating. You're saying, if I were to use these words, that might set off that person in this direction, or that might make this person happy. If I say this compliment, this person might smile. It might make their day better. If I tell this person I'm on camera, I shouldn't, but fill in the blank, it might really ruin their day, and maybe that's my intended purpose. So you have some concept of what are the consequences of the things you're going to say through future simulation. So now, speech and understanding and production fit very nicely within history and future and context, which is entirely based on memory. Right? Remember, memory is the most formidable simulating device that you have. If I tell you right now to close your eyes, and do that exercise for me, just close your eyes. Imagine you're on a beach. And really, truly, fully imagine this vividly as much as you can. Imagine that you're on a beach, ocean waves, surfing, whatever it may be, the beach of your choice, right? This is a creative simulation exercise. Okay, now open your eyes, and I want somebody to volunteer to tell me what beach they thought of.
Corona del Mar.
Corona del Mar. Have you been to Corona del Mar? You've been to that beach. You simulated the beach you knew. Is there anyone who simulated the beach that was totally alien to them? Okay, tell me about that beach.
It's just, it was a beach, and there were waves, and it wasn't a place I'd been before.
Okay.
It was somewhere.
What did it look like?
White sand,
Uh-huh.
blue water.
Uh-huh.
It was sunny.
Yeah.
There was a nice wind. It was hot, but it wasn't scorching.
Okay.
It was in another country.
Another country, okay. Could it be somewhere that you might have seen on TV, in a movie or in a show, or?
Perhaps.
Perhaps. And I would venture a guess, just based on the biology, that necessarily that would have been true. Because the only information that you have ever had about beaches has either been you being physically there, or you seeing it or hearing it from somewhere else. So this business about creativity and imagination and simulation is entirely based on taking our past experiences and reconfiguring it. Okay? When you come up with something new, new does not have any real meaning except it's a new configuration, right? It's a new combination of elements that have always been there. So anytime that you're trying to creatively imagine yourself in a situation that you've never experienced, you bring everything that your brain has ever stored to bear on that situation. Things you might have watched on TV, shows you might have been to, people that you've seen, friends that you know, and of course things that you have experienced yourself, including all of what I just said. Yeah.
So how does the concept of fantasy come into this?
Because
fantasy is the things that are not real in our world.
Right.
Dragons and I guess dragons are based on lizards and we've got
see, you led me right to it. Okay, keep going. What else?
But the concept of magic.
Uh-huh.
I guess magic is just a way of explaining the unexplained.
Sure, and everything, any technology that is,
Yes,
right?
So just modern day magic.
Of course.
But back then, I'm just trying to conceptualize certain areas things we haven't discovered yet, or things that seemingly come from nothing else. You know what I mean?
Sure. But if let's take magic, for example. Think about the roots of this. Think about the very first instantiation of magic. Could there have been some experiences that may not have been magic, but seemed like magic?
Yeah.
Now, elaborate that a little bit, and you can think of a creative construction that would allow it to very much look like magic. But the pieces that build magic, so for example, let's say it's magic that makes something disappear, right? Why does that seem like magic to you?
Because there's no explanation.
Well, but think about what you know about objects and their place in space. Let's say that you lived in a very different environment where things disappear all the time.
It's the laws of physics and universality.
Which is exactly what you've stored in your knowledge base, in other words, your memories, right? So your interpretation of something as magical, as different, is essentially saying, here's what I know is possible. Now let me take something that I have never seen as possible and use that to construct my fantasy world.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's a very simplistic sort of reductionist view, and I'm sure you can, find a situation in which I'm wrong. But in general, I would argue that that's what you're doing. And you did exactly that when you talked about dragons and said, it's, really coming from lizards, and it has kind of the same appearance and so on. But think about whenever aliens are depicted.
Yeah.
Why are aliens always depicted as humanoid? Not always, but for the most part.
Never mind.
No, tell me, what are you thinking?
I know that, oftentimes the reason that we picture, a gray alien with, big eyes is because when they first started making, movies about aliens, that's what they had access to.
Totally.
It was easy to just, paint someone and basically build off of what we know. So whenever we think of aliens now, we're like, well, yeah, they might end up looking like us.
Right.
Because that's, in films, that's what we see usually.
That's right. Yeah.
I also like to think that comes from the narcissism of human beings. How they're like, well, we're the most intelligent creatures
See,
on the
this is,
planet.
it couldn't have been more you said the narcissism of human beings, but I would argue it's not the narcissism, it's just memory. This is what we know. This is all we know. So if you ask me to kind of come up with a fantastical reality, the only thing I can do is say, there are elements of this fantastical reality that will come from my reality, things that I know, but then I'm going to tweak it, I'm going to do certain things to it to make it seem magical and really more fictional. So it's a humanoid, but we got to make them look a little bit more alien, a little bit different, so maybe their heads are larger, they got bigger brains, their eyes are going to be big bug eyes and so on. Let's come up with something creative like that, and then that's the image that sticks. All right? Yeah.
Can memory itself be considered an experience?
Yes.
So
yeah.
I was thinking of...
Oh, this is like advanced, this is 201. All right, yes.
Because I was thinking of...
Yeah, yeah. Yes, no, this is amazing.
Well, I
Yeah,
was thinking of, if someone were on a trip via a psychedelic drug,
yes,
what they're seeing and what is in their mind
Yeah.
is a creation of their mind that is viewed as an experience, but it's not actually a reality experience.
that's right. But it is an experience. Your brain doesn't know the difference, and then that becomes a memory.
Okay.
So two things. One, you're absolutely right. Any experience that you have, no matter how fantastical it is, it becomes a memory because your brain has gone through it, and we have the capacity to store pretty much everything that happens to us. But the other piece that's really important is that every time that you retrieve a memory from your past, that is a new memory. It is a new trace because that's going to have elements of your retrieval right now, all sorts of contextual influences. The notion itself has an operational name to it, a little bit of a jargon called reconsolidation. Right? I like to think of it as memory flexibility and malleability. It's the reason why false memories arise all the time. Beth Loftus here at UCI has made a career out of studying false memories. And false memories are no different than true memories, except that every time that they are retrieved, they get reconstructed. So memory is not veridical. It's not a 100% true, accurate record of the past. It's not a picture, it's not a video. It's a reconstruction, and that reconstruction can be very active. Depending on what's happening at the time, you can progressively change your memories over time. So if you're 90 and writing your autobiography, it's mostly lies by that time, right?
You see, earlier they said that we don't think in words. I'd wonder if we don't think in words, firstly, what do we think in, and do we all think in the same, do some of us think in feelings and some of us think in pictures,
Yeah.
and how does that work?
Yeah, that's another great question. So we don't just think in words. So we tend to think in much more cohesive units, right? Things that are much more the building blocks of our narrative. But there are differences. There are individual differences. So some individuals will picture things much more easily than others. Some are more verbal. Some are much more sort of visual. But it's not to say that not everybody has all of these abilities. I would suggest to you that given just what we know about the biology and how much of the brain is devoted to visual processing, that most of us who can visualize things, can really imagine things in not even 3D but 4D, so kind of the temporal dimension, also time being a variable dimension, so think of things as a movie all the time, that's going to be harnessing all of what you have in your brain. Because the brain is built around encoding things in that video format. creating narratives and stories, not just a series of still images, but a real full narrative. So the more visual the person can get, you find that more creative they are. And that includes poets. That includes people who all tend to think much more verbally. They are still imaginative, much more imaginative in the way they think about things. They may encode it down to words, but what they're visualizing is much more than words. It's the emotion, it's how they feel, it's the context, all of it together. Make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Did you have a question, Laurie?
I was just going to add on Sydney's thing. Is that kind of like how gaslighting works? People rely on, create false memories through common experiences that others, in order to manipulate others.
Yeah, yeah. And there's lots of examples historically of this. And it happens today too.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, memory is, that's the unfortunate side effect, right? It's a great device. It's wonderful to have. It's your most powerful weapon because it's what allows you to simulate and create and do all of those things. But it can also be hacked, right? I mean, now that you know that it's malleable, conversations with someone else who might have had a shared experience or a therapist or whatever, it can really lead to a completely reconstructed narrative that in some cases can go from very innocent to very pathological, right? And all of these things can happen to memories because they're not these static images, they're constantly changing. Okay? Yeah.
How tied is memory to like physical body? Because I know there are times where people will think back on memories and their body will start reacting in the same way as if they were going through it again. I know this is sometimes typical with people who have PTSD.
Yes.
But also just with like when you think back on like food, you get hungry. Like
Yeah. Intimately related. So this mind-body connection is very powerful. Very powerful. So being able to relive the experience, a really good indicator of how much you're actually reliving the experience is whether or not you get the physiological arousal that you had when you first had the experience. Recapitulating that. So if I were to go back and relive the moment when my first child was born, not my second one, but my first one was born. I'm just kidding. Don't tell her I said that. But when I think about that moment, it brings tears to my eyes, and my heart starts to palpitate, and I have that emotional arousal. It was a very, very emotional day. There was an earthquake. There was a lot of things going on, and I have what I think are flashbulb memories of that day. Everything is sort of visually encoded in my brain. But those are very important experiences, and it's not every single day that is going to be able to generate those kinds of memories. But there's going to be certain events that are very salient, that had a lot of high emotional arousal, that when they come back with full scale and kind of reliving that experience, they should allow you to kind of relive it physiologically as well as mentally. So you get the body physiological reactivity as well. Now this goes both ways, and this is kind of where probably Dave would take this next, is the physiological arousal, because it's tied to the mind. We know that stimulating the mind phenomenon will also bring back the body's physiological arousal. It can work the other way as well. So by stimulating the physiological arousal, you can go back and relink to the mind. In other words, being able to get that excitation, that arousal, that higher heart rate and palpitation, all these things can trigger emotional arousal, can trigger memory, can trigger a much richer retrieval or a much richer encoding of the situation. So it's a bidirectional communication channel, because everything that's in your body is under control of the brain, and everything in your body also feeds back information to your brain. Anytime, even if you just prick your finger, all of that goes to your brain and is interpreted in some way. And then the brain sends signals back that says, oh, this wasn't dangerous, this is not a spider crawling on you, it's your finger, you're fine, right? Yeah.
You see, if I was to ask you, like, picture your first child, and like in front of your eyes, like you can see your child, but you can't actually see them. You know
That's
what I mean?
right.
Like, what's going on in our minds that when you evoke like a picture of you can both see it and not see it at the same time?
Did you have a response?
And then I also had a question, because I know that there's a phenomenon where people cannot do that. Like people
Oh,
can't
really?
Yes.
see in their
Yes. Oh, I was just going to go there. Okay, perfect. So yes, there are. So what you're talking about is imagery, visual imagery. And if I were to put you on an MRI scanner right now and give you what's called a functional MRI scan, so I ask you questions, I ask you to look at pictures or close your eyes and try to imagine something, and then I can look at brain activity in different parts of your brain. It turns out that if I show you a picture and record brain activity in the visual cortex, which is in the back of the head, back of the brain, and then later on not show you that picture and say, I showed you a picture of a church bell earlier, can you visualize it? What I see is activity in your brain that looks just like when you saw that picture. It's incredible. I'm telling you, it's the best simulation device known to man. Computers can't even do it as well. So, in other words, your brain is able to imagine it even if you don't close your eyes. That's the funny thing. Like right now I can see my daughter's face without closing my eyes, and I can still see all of you. So it's this incredible ability to kind of keep two things in mind. I know, it's mind-blowingly cool.
It trips you out a lot.
I was visualizing what your daughter's face looked like.
I don't even know.
What do you mean?
Like I was imagining what your
Oh, you were. Oh, yeah. See, exactly. Because it's so natural. Like that's what our brains just do naturally. When I say visualize, imagine, create that image, you immediately start to jump to that. And of course, so what was your name? I'm sorry?
Audrey.
Audrey. So Audrey's comments is also very, very well placed, which is there are individuals who can't do that. And it turns out that those individuals have memory problems. So if you have a patient that has a lesion in a part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is very, very important for memory, turns out they can't remember much, they can't make new memories, but if you ask them to simulate the future or imagine what their life looks, they can't do it. They cannot do it. They try, and then if you look at their vividness ratings and all the things they generate compared to healthy controls, it's not even a chance, doesn't even compare. So when the machinery in our brains that is really important for memory is disrupted, our ability to simulate and predict and imagine and be creative also is disrupted. That's pretty cool. By the way, that work comes from Dan Schachter, who's at Harvard. And he's phenomenal. He wrote a book called The 7 Sins of Memory, and he talks about this. His more recent work in the last 10 years has entirely focused on imagination. Very, very cool stuff. Yeah.
That just makes me curious. Like, I'm wondering about dreams. Like,
Yeah.
some people have dreams, and like for me, like when I have a dream, sometimes I have like a night terror or a nightmare, and it freaks me out that I wake up and I completely forget about it in a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Like I'm not sure what that is about.
You and me both. So you know how many times I've been asked to like interpret dreams. So dreams are difficult. It's hard for us to say something scientific about dreams. I can tell you a lot about what happens when you're dreaming, which is called rapid eye movements, REM, and the activity of the brain looks very much like the awake brain with some subtle differences. You have the rapid eye movements, which means you're moving your eyeballs, and it looks like you're kind of imagining and visualizing something, but it turns out that a subset of people will wake up from that dream and be able to report exactly on what they dreamt, and most everybody else wakes up and they have no idea what they dreamt. They just know they did, but they have no idea on the content. They might remember bits and pieces, but it's no more than that. It gets even better. There are folks who will wake up from a dream and be able to control it such that they can go back into the same dream. And there are folks who can dream and have what's called lucid dreaming, and they can actually control their own actions in a dream. That's really cool. No one understands that. No one has a clue how that works. But the notion of how our dream is related to memory is still one that is being worked on. So some scientists, neuroscientists, have suggested that dreams have this interesting application of being able to do some creative reconstruction of memories that may or may not make sense together. That's why you kind of get some weird ideas like why I'm in my parents' basement and now I'm on a boat and now I'm doing this and doing that, because it's like the attempt to kind of recreate memories, and some of it is successful and it fits fine and gets stored. Some of it is unsuccessful and gets thrown away, but you're somehow subjected to it as a dream. I don't like that idea. I don't like that hypothesis, particularly because it doesn't seem to have like a lot of evidence for it, but it's certainly something that people have talked about. So at the end of the day, this is the one where I'm going to say, I just don't know. I just don't know. I think dreams are cool, but I know very little about them. You had your hand up a second ago?
It was relating to
Okay.
but yeah.
Okay, all right. Yeah.
So I can swear I've dreamt something so often that it's felt like a memory.
Yeah.
Like-
So you might have had recurring dreams.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah. So
To this
recurring
day, I'm
dreams.
afraid of driving off a bridge.
Yeah, so recurring dreams do happen, and actually, so the neuroscientists don't have a good explanation, the psychologists do. And they, of course, you can imagine, the psychologists have a theory for everything. And we're not going to go into the Freudian version of this.
no.
But in general, it is thought that recurring dreams are sort of the mind's indication of something that causes a lot of anxiety for you, something that you're very worried about, something that is a recurring theme in your life, and it may not be exactly reflective, like you may not be worried about actually driving off of a cliff, but that's sort of symbolic for something else. That's a psychological explanation. You can tell I snapped into a different mode when I talked about that because it has like no biological basis.
Yeah.
But that's what people have suggested about recurring dreams, is that they're kind of stemming from some perpetual anxiety about a particular thing, and until that anxiety is resolved, the recurring dream will continue to recur. Now, the fact that you remember it means that it's a memory. And now that it feels like a memory, you're basically just reaffirming the fact that memory is reconstructive. Whether it was dream or reality, doesn't matter. You experienced it, which means your brain is going to code it as a memory.
Okay.
So it totally makes sense that you remember it as if it actually happened. I have dreams from my past that feel like that way too.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
What about the idea of deja vu?
Yeah. Oh, you guys are full of great questions. So, deja vu. There are several explanations. I'll tell you my favorite one. My favorite one is what I call faulty pattern completion or faulty recognition. In other words, it is an experience that you have that could be remarkably similar to something else you've experienced in the past. So it starts to activate some of the same brain cells, and if enough of them activated, they kind of spark the old memory, and it's so powerful that it almost convinces your brain that this is exactly what you've experienced before. So it feels like you're just reliving a past experience, rather than it's just similar to it. It cued the past experience, and that's what I retrieved. So it's what's called overwhelmingly strong familiarity. But it's familiarity because you've experienced something very, very similar to it, but not identical to it. Because obviously you have not lived multiple. I mean, there's the multiple lives explanation too. I like that one. So if you past lives. Yeah. Or a glitch in the matrix. That's my other favorite one.
What's the neuroscience between both of those?
Which one?
I'm joking.
The glitch in the matrix? Oh, I could tell you. No, I'm kidding. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's just interesting because a lot of time when I experience deja vu, it feels like, it doesn't necessarily feel like a memory, but it feels like a dream.
Yes.
Like I
Yes.
saw it in a dream.
That's right. That's right. And for some people, it can be more powerful. Even they can say, "I know what's going to happen next," because they feel like they've really lived it before. But it turns out that's just a feeling. You actually don't know what happens next. But when it does, you feel like you did. So it's all post hoc. You know, you're just kind of reinterpreting. It's like the mind tricking you in a very, very kind of weird way.
That's just all you basing off of past experiences.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And it's all like probability.
Exactly. It's exactly. There's like a 97% probability based on the familiarity level that this is the same thing you experienced in the past, because your brain doesn't know that time is linear and keeps going,
And the deja
right?
vu is just reinforcing that
Exactly.
idea.
Exactly. Yeah.
So since your brain is, during deja vu, since your brain is essentially telling you that like you have experienced this before, is your brain kind of telling you that like this moment right now is a memory because like it feels dreamlike?
It's not clear that your brain can tell you that this moment is a memory. All your brain can tell you is that I'm experiencing a very, very high level of familiarity. It feels like I've experienced the situation before, right? So you get the reliving of the experience. Like if this is an experience where there was some physiological arousal, you might start to kind of feel the same way. But it really is, you know, if you think about different cells that are interconnected, and they might have a bunch of connections between them, with the idea being that if you were to reactivate one of these units, it might reactivate the rest of this and kind of activate the whole memory. Let's say this is the black cat, right? I'm just making the matrix example happen here. But let's say this is the thing that you saw, and that thing in the past has been connected to a certain experience. When you see it again, it goes back and triggers that experience. So once you activate this cell, other cells that are connected to it are going to be active too, okay? This is a principle in neuroscience that comes from Donald Hebb called cells that fire together, wire together. Right? Isn't that cool? Yeah. So these guys have fired together before, and now they've wired together. So now when you get one to fire, all the ones that are wired to it are also going to fire. Okay?
Is that referred to as a neural network?
Yes. That is my little sketch of a neural network with 6 cells.
So that's like
We have like 6 trillion. But yeah.
programming of your synapses
Yeah.
to different conditions.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Cool. See, he used the S word too.
What is that?
Synapses.
Nice.
I like neuroscience.
Excellent. Well, we should chat at some point. We'll convert you to a neuroscientist.
Yeah, no, you can't.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
So, okay, so listen, I want to throw something out because
I have to run in a couple
Dr.
minutes.
Yassa has to
Yeah.
leave in
Yeah.
very short.
Yeah.
So before we thank him, does anybody have any questions specifically about or ideas about how you might apply what you've learned today to your writing? And or not, if you have another question, that's okay too. But I'm curious to see if there's anything that you would like to ask him about writing, about the process of writing in terms of how your brain functions.
How can you use the power of linguistics with neurology in order to recapture like certain memories and moments for audience perceptions. Can you combine that with other senses to create a more visceral
Yes.
reaction?
Yes, so that's the idea, is that, I mean, there's two ways to think about this, and Dave can tell you a little bit more about NLP, which I'm not a big believer, but it's fine. You can tell them about it, it's fine. You know, so neurolinguistic programming it's neither neurolinguistic nor programming, but you could tell them about it because I think it's a very powerful kind of methodology. But in terms of being able to use the linguistics to build a very comprehensive image, that's the way to be able to do it. To be able to trigger a memory, to build a memory, to invoke a certain emotion, and basically the more senses that you can have, the better. So when we did this little guided exercise before, I did it very, very hastily. If I really wanted you to kind of imagine it, I would ask you to report on the sights, the sounds, how the air feels on your face, all the temperature that you're feeling, all of those things. Feel it completely with all of your senses, okay? And the more comprehensive that picture is, the better the writing is going to be. Right? Because that's how you build a complete visual image. So don't just think about what somebody says or what somebody looks like or what somebody's, you know, facial expression might look like. Think about everything else that's happening. Think about the context. Think about what they're feeling, what literally the quality of the air is, how dimly lit the room might be, all of those things, because that changes the visual image that you're able to create with words. Okay?
So we talked briefly about when writing characters and really stepping into their shoes and the empathy and making our own new memories or how we react to the situation. Do you think that could be applied to linguistic patterns and speech patterns in writing the dialogue? I think a big struggle I'm having is stepping out of how I say things, and I'm curious if there's any way I can unravel my linguistic assumptions about speaking to really find new voices that aren't my own.
Yeah, so that's a challenge,
Yeah.
right? Finding a new voice that's not your own is a challenge because you can't just do it based on the voice. You have to do it based on everything else that gives rise to that voice. So it doesn't mean it's not possible, it just means that's a challenge, but that's the challenge that you have in front of you, is that you have to build so much more narrative around what that voice is before you use that voice, right? But absolutely, it's definitely doable. Yeah.
And we're going to do that today.
Excellent. All right, last one that I got to head out for another meeting, unfortunately.
It's kind of based off that. In an attempt to do that, since what you're saying is we base everything that we do and create on past experiences, would something helpful be literally thinking of the voice of someone we know?
Yes.
And basing it off of
Yes, absolutely. So just like the beach was a beach that, I mean, for you it wasn't, but for, you know, so yes, of course, especially if that voice sounds exactly like the kind of voice that you'd like to maybe modify a little bit for the character and the dialogue that you're building. 100%. It may be a voice that you know, it may be a voice that you've heard somewhere, but use everything that you have experienced in the past to try to build those pieces. So yeah, because I mean, think about what else would you have otherwise, right? Starting completely from scratch with no knowledge at all of what that voice might look like or might sound like is a tall order. And it's going to be nowhere near as rich as starting with something that you know and can build a complete picture around. All right. Thank you, guys.